Hey everybody, welcome to Turfgrass. So this is the Turfgrass Pest Management. The blur's getting rid of it, but yeah, I don't know. It's the Turfgrass Pest Management Category 3A for Michigan applicators. And this is going to basically be a study guide. And it's going to be all about the book. So if you want to follow along in the book while you listen, that'll help you. It's probably going to be pretty applicable to other turf grass categories in various states. It's probably not going to be exact, especially once we hit the law section. I think that's chapter 3. But I just wanted to let you guys know that this is all about turfgrass pest management, and we're following the Michigan Turfgrass Pest Management book for category 3A. So if you guys are studying for that, I hope this helps you. Awesome feedback on the National Core series. So I wanted to continue going on the books that I have. Right now, my plan is to finish 3A for you guys. And then once I do that, it was actually requested that I jump into 7F, which is mosquitoes. And I happen to own and operate a mosquito control company. So that one should come pretty easy to me. As I did have to study that myself. And then I'll probably dive into 3B and then category 6, which is right-of-way. So we have ornamentals and then right-of-way. And then also category 7A, because I actually have to take that exam myself. So while I'm studying that for myself, I'm also going to be making one of these to help you guys study. Quick synopsis in case you don't know who I am, and that was all a bunch of gibberish. My name is Austin Douglas. I'm the owner of Elevate Applicate and Ditch the Itch Poison Ivy and Mosquito Control Services over here in Goodrich, Michigan. I've been a pesticide applicator for the last 10 years, and I absolutely love what I do, and I want to teach this. And I'm actually going to be at a speaking engagement for the Michigan Green Industry Association here in the next couple weeks in the first week of March. So if you guys are going to attend that, if you attend the core classes, you're likely going to see me teach you, which is pretty cool. But without further ado, let's dive into Turfgrass Pest Management, Chapter 1, the principles of integrated pest management. So integrated pest management, in like a general term, is utilizing every single strategy and method you can without chemicals and with chemicals. Right? If you can control a pest without chemicals, in integrated pest management, you would want to do that. If you, if it's an insect or disease, or maybe, in the sense of turf grass, if it was, broadleaf weeds in the lawn, it's not really ideal to go out there and pluck every single one of those weeds. And so it's more efficient, excuse me, and cost effective to actually just go out there and spray a chemical and kill them, right? But it's all in how you do it, right? You don't need to necessarily do a blanket application every time you go onto a property. Eventually, once you get it down to, a certain threshold, at that point, you can switch over to like a spot treatment, right? So that's kind of what this is going to be about, the principles of integrated pest management, which if you watch the core series, you'll have a pretty good idea of what integrated pest management is. But this is more tailored towards what is integrated pest management in terms of turf grass. Okay. So here's the objectives for this chapter. You want to be able to list the principles of IPM. More than likely, that'll be on the exam if you are testing to take your category 3A or turf grass exam. Understand why pesticides should be the last resort in pest management. What can we do before we have to introduce chemicals? Describe the 5 steps of IPM. So there are 5 steps, and we need to be able to know them. If you watched the core course, you probably have heard them, but we'll just go over them again. List tools and techniques you could use to identify a problem, right? So diagnostic tools, how can you identify if there's insects, diseases, broadleaf weeds, things like that. Understand concepts such as economic injury level and action thresholds. So we'll talk about that. Understand methods that are chemical free. Interesting, right? How can we deal with pests without chemicals? Factors when making your pest management program. So what do you need to take into consideration to make it a quality pest management program? And understand biological controls. What can we do that doesn't involve chemicals? Maybe it doesn't involve manual labor, so to say, but what can we do as far as biology goes? And then also, lastly, define pesticide characteristics to look for when choosing products for pests. So let's start. All right. The basic principles for turfgrass pests. 1, healthy plants are less susceptible to insects and disease issues. That phrase covers any plant on earth, whether it's turfgrass, whether it's a shrub, whether it's a tree. If it's healthy, if it's within a healthy environment, it's got healthy soil, healthy roots, adequate water, the right temperatures, it's going to be able to withstand all sorts of pest pressure. So that is kind of a universal statement for all plants. I just want you guys to know that beyond just turf, right? What makes a plant healthy, right? Quality, as far as turf goes, quality seed, quality soil, the right fertility in the soil, right? We need the nutrition for those plants to grow, moisture, and pH levels. If the pH levels are off, what can happen is you'll get some nutrient lockouts. Nutrients won't be available for those plants. They'll start to show signs and symptoms that they're deficient. And it's actually not that they're deficient because the nutrients are in the soil. It's just a matter that the nutrients are locked out. They're not available to the plant because of the pH levels. And then obviously plant selection plays a big portion and part in this. You don't want to put turf down that is really a full sun turf in a full shaded area. It's just not going to work, right? So we need to have all of these things in line to make a healthy plant. So here's number 2. I'm actually going to zoom out of here a little bit more to make this a little bit bigger. So number 2, we need to identify the problem. What is the problem? Is there a problem? What's causing this problem? What do we need to do, right? What is the pest causation or the environmental factors? Which one is it? Is it the environment that's causing pests to come out? Is it pests that are causing issues with the plants? What's going on here? And then we also need to correctly identify the pest. That allows you to make the correct decisions with the correct products. If you don't know how to identify the pest or what the pest is, how can you make an adequate management plan for that pest? It just doesn't make sense. And the reality is that some pests can cause very similar damage, but they require very different strategies. And in the book, they made a comparison between the Japanese beetles and the European chafer grubs. European chafer grubs, or larvae, I should say, cause problems on non-irrigated turf. But Japanese beetles cause damage on irrigated turf. And so that is an identifier and a clue to what you're dealing with. But their damage looks very, very similar. Okay. And then a non-chemical control that we could implement on a European chafer larva would be to irrigate the turf, right? If they don't cause damage on irrigated lawns, then that's one way to solve the issue without a chemical, right? Just water the lawn. Super simple. All right. So the third basic principle for turfgrass pests, we need to expect some pests, and we also need to tolerate some damage. It's very difficult to make it 100%. And even in a situation like this golf course here, that is something that those people provide the absolute most maintenance for, right? There's no better turfgrass places than golf courses. And even they have pests, and they expect it. And they have more traffic than most lawns out there because people are playing them. They've got golf carts. People are taking clubs and chipping chunks of grass out. I mean, we have to expect some damage. But another thing is no landscape is pest-free, right? That's a given. And we need to be able to know that and say that to our clients confidently and be like, it can't be pest-free, but we can bring it down to acceptable levels. And generally, damage to the turf is largely aesthetic, right? So it's just visual. It's not like the turf is just going to outright die. It's just a visual thing, and it'll bounce back when the conditions are right. But we also need to set thresholds of intervention, and that'll be determined by you and your client, right? What are the thresholds to come in there and do something? And you need to be able to say that with confidence to your client, be like, hey, when you see this, that's when we need to do something. I can't be really specific on that because it's just it's an in general principle. But that's also going to be determined by the value and visibility of the turf, right? If somebody's lawn is on the corner on a very prestigious neighborhood, or maybe it's a business, they might want their lawn to look exceptional because they're the staple when you pull into that area. But if it's, somebody that's in the back 40 of a subdivision and hardly anyone sees it, or they're in a cul-de-sac and no one sees it, they might not really care, right? And then traffic tolerance. Turf is damaged by traffic pretty significantly. Excessive traveling over it, whether that be foot traffic or vehicles, can really do some damage to turf. And honestly, the traffic can look like certain issues and diseases out there. So you got to have a good eye when you're looking at turf and what you're looking at. Okay, so the system software did not convert this very well, but 4, right, as far as a basic principle, is to use pesticides as a last option, not the first. Okay. The reason is because we want to use pesticides when all other options are ineffective or not very practical, right? Like I said in the beginning, if you're going to go out to a yard and pluck out every single broadleaf weed by hand, that's not very practical when you could walk the lawn and treat it with a broadleaf specific herbicide and kill all of those. It's a lot more cost effective. Now, you do have those people out there that are, all organic, and they might be willing to pay you to go out there and pluck all of those. But at the end of the day, it's not really efficient. And I don't know that I would choose that person as my client personally, but to each their own. And we always want to use pesticides according to the label. The label is the law. It is a legal document. And so we absolutely need to follow the label. And we need to be concerned and use pesticides less, right? Think spot treatments versus broadcast treatments. If you controlled the broadleaf weeds in a lawn down to a sufficient level, you do not need to apply an herbicide where there's no weeds. There's no point. It's a waste of product. It's additional pollution and contamination of the earth and the soil, potentially the water. So you need to stop doing that and start thinking spot treatments, right? Just target those weeds individually. Now you're going to use less product, less time, and you're going to deliver fantastic results. We all, excuse me. Whew. We also want to select pesticide products that are safer for the applicator, the environment, and we also want to consider resistance, right? Some weeds are becoming resistant to herbicides out there, and we need to be conscious of it. Same thing with insecticides. Some insects are becoming resistant to certain insecticides. It's generally the insects that have more than one generation a year, but still we need to be conscious of it. So use pesticides less, so that way they're more specific, that way they work. And then dial down your treatments to the point where you're just spot spraying. Because at that point, it's relatively easy. You just got to go through the lawn and find those couple weeds and bam, bam, they're done. Also, you want to know if a site has a historical pest issue, something that you might not be aware of if it's your first time at the site, or maybe even a couple times at the site, right? Maybe they had some serious issues in previous years with a certain type of pest, grubs or army worms, whatever. But you need to know, so that way you can take the proper precautions and maybe use preventative measures to stop it. If you follow an IPM program, you likely address a pest issue as needed versus scheduled pesticide applications. And that's just a really interesting line, because when you think of all the lawn care companies out there, they have programs, right? 7-app programs, 6-app programs. And I read that line and it made me wonder, are they actually following an IPM program or not? I really don't know, because this here says it's as needed. So if you have a schedule, are you really following an IPM program? It's questionable. It really is. And this is also an addition to 4. I found these to be pretty valuable in the book. You want to consider the natural enemies to certain pests, right? The pesticide applications that we make on lawns and turf can damage beneficial populations and natural enemies. And if we're doing that, what can happen is you can have a resurgence of the pest, and there's no beneficials to take care of them like there once was. It's very common to see this in like mosquito control applications, where you'll make an application and all of a sudden mites start to break out on certain trees and shrubs. And you're wondering what the heck's going on? Well, it's because you killed all the beneficials from a mosquito application. So you got to be super conscious of it, right? And you also want to consider biomagnification. What is biomagnification? It's the buildup of pesticides in a pest body that is not strong enough to kill them. But if a predator eats enough of these pests, they could potentially be exposed to a fatal dose. And now we're resulting in off-target damage, which we don't want, right? So we need to really be conscious of what we're doing on lawns and how we're using pesticides. Okay, so this is about integrated pest management. Basically, integrated pest management is using all acceptable methods and strategies to ensure an acceptable product is produced economically with the least disruptive effects on the environment. That is one definition of IPM. And it's a pretty good one, right? What can we do that's economical, that's not going to harm the environment? You know, it might be chemicals. That might be the most economical method and least harmful to the environment, versus, you know, going out there with a tiller or, you know, scraping the soil out and replanting. Those are all options that you could do for turf. Be like, well, your turf sucks, so we're just going to, you know, bulldoze it out and put all new turf in. That's going to disturb the environment pretty substantially. And the goal of an IPM program is to maintain acceptable levels for both aesthetics and economic damage in regards to the pests. So we already know that we should expect some damage, right? We should anticipate and expect it and tolerate it. But this is basically saying we need to keep it down to an acceptable level, both for aesthetic purposes, but also economic purposes. And then IPM also looks at the entire ecosystem, right? Managing a pest problem over time. So what is the butterfly effect, so to say, of managing this pest right now? What's it going to do to the environment? What are these applications going to do to the environment? We need to be conscious of all of this stuff. And then what's the most effective and least hazardous to the environment? That's pretty critical to know. So the 5 steps of turf IP. All right, so we are going to go through the 5 steps. Some steps we dive into more than others just because of what it entails. But let's start. So step 1, detecting and monitoring agents injuring turf grass. Excuse me, I got this cough. I got a cough drop in. It's not helping. Detection happens when regular monitoring occurs, right? So if you're not looking at the turf very frequently, you're not going to be able to find the pest. So you need to monitor in order to detect. And you're looking for stress. You're looking for pest activity. And it's vital to find out the cause, because without knowing exactly what's causing the injury, you're just guessing. And guessing in an IPM program is unacceptable. If you were to guess and be wrong, you could be over-applying or applying the wrong pesticide in general, and you don't need to, and it's just a waste of chemicals, time, money, blah, blah, blah. So you don't want to do that. It's not ideal for managing turf to just guess. Same thing with trees and shrubs and everything else. It's not the right way to do it. This also allows you to identify a problem before it reaches an economically damaging level. So if you can detect it quickly, right, the first detection of an issue, you can have a quick response, which then would reduce the cost of damage and then the cost of the applications to fix the damage. It's also a lot easier to manage smaller populations to an acceptable threshold than it is to reduce large pest populations to acceptable thresholds. So it just makes sense, right? If you're dealing with a smaller amount of pests, a smaller issue, it's not going to be a big deal. It's not going to be a large expense. And then let's talk about some monitoring techniques for turf. So we need to do a visual inspection like this guy is here. You need to have your binoculars and hang out in the turf and look. He's got all those dandelions in front of him, and I doubt he can see them right in front of him, right? But you want to look for pupal cases That'll tell you if there's certain insects there. Same thing if you're looking for frass. That'll tell you if there's poop in the area from an insect or an animal, what's going on. Fruiting bodies of fungi. So if you're analyzing the leaves, or if you see fungus growing in the turf, well, now you have a pretty good idea of what's going on. You're going to look for lesions on the leaf. That'll tell you if there might be some sort of disease activity. And you should really spend time examining the turf. That's going to help you. Okay. There's also the coffee can technique, which you can insert a coffee can into the turf, fill it with water. It's going to collect the insects, and then you can come back and examine them to determine if there is a threat. It's going to collect beneficials. It's going to collect pests. It's going to collect everything in that little area. There's also the white paper test. The white paper test is when you remove a piece of sod, spread it over a piece of paper, shake it, disturb it, and see if any pests come out. So that's more or less for a grub identification. Not too many people that I know do that. They don't cut out turf and examine it, but it is recommended to do that. And also for the coffee can technique, that's really only going to be ideal if you're going to that property a lot. I could see that being beneficial to golf courses, because they're going to have guys on that golf course every single day. But if you're going to residential properties, you're likely not going to do that just because it's not efficient or cost effective. I'm sorry, root sampling. So I guess that was another one I mixed up there. But you're going to cut out a 12 by 12 section, shake it, and inspect for grubs. You can do that with white paper, things like that. Disclosing solutions. So that is when you're going to spray basically water with soap over an area on the turf, and it's an irritant to insects. And so those insects will then come to the surface and get on grass blades and stuff like that. And you will be able to see what's in there. They want to escape that, right? Then we also have pitfall traps. Pitfall traps, very similar to the coffee can technique. Again, it's not an ideal way to monitor if you're not going to be there frequently, because this right here says you need to inspect it daily. And also you could use alcohol or water for this method. If you're using alcohol, you need to make sure that the hole that the insects can get into is small, because you don't want other animals to drink the alcohol, get drunk, or potentially die, right? So I don't think that that's really the best monitoring technique unless you're at the property pretty consistently. There's also pheromone bait traps, which are going to attract various insects to them. They generally have sex attractants to them. They're very good for monitoring, but not ideal for reduction. So you're not going to use a bunch of sticky traps or pheromone traps to reduce the pests on a property. It's just going to be to identify what you have. And it can also be used to say, like, okay, here, we know what we have in the beginning. We counted how many we have on the sticky trap. Let's do an application, put another sticky trap out and see what happens. And you can actually see the reduction. Similarly, in mosquito control, they do what's called the arm test, where you put out your arm at a certain time of day and you count how many bites over the course of a certain time limit. And then you do an application, you come back the very next day or a week later or 2 weeks later, whatever, and you do the exact same test at the exact same time and see how many bites you're getting. And that'll tell you how much the population's been reduced. So just a quick little tidbit there on mosquitoes. But pest emergence can vary year to year based on temperature. And we measure when our pests are going to come out based on growing degree days. This is a scientific method that tells us fairly accurately when pests are going to emerge. Like this year, we're already accumulating our growing degree days here in Michigan in February, which typically we don't have any. We might have like 1 or 2 at most, but right now we're starting to get up to like 10. So it's happening quick this year. And then this is how you calculate growing degree days. Guaranteed, if you're studying to take the exam, you're going to have questions on this and also how to calculate it. You're probably going to have a question on calculating one, to be honest. But you establish a base, and if there was a question on the exam, it would tell you what the base is that you're calculating. Most people, except for the scientists, are going to use base 50 just because it's simple math. But you take the high temp of the day, the low temp of the day, add those together, divide it by 2, and then subtract 50. And then that will equal your growing degree days. If it's not above 50, it's 0. So the moment that it's 1, now you're starting to add growing degree days. And these are cumulative. So you might have 1 growing degree day today. Tomorrow you might have 8. And then in combination, now you have a total of 9 growing degree days, and they accumulate. And they don't go backwards. So it's not like if you have a warm spell that these turn off, right? You don't reset it. You reset it every year. And that's it. But they are cumulative. Okay. This was not in the book, but for you guys, this is very helpful. I use this. I know a lot of people use this. Enviroweather.msu.edu is a fantastic website for calculating growing degree days. If you can navigate this website, you can also find information on various pests in lawns and crops and trees and shrubs. It'll tell you what growing degree days they come out at. You come here to EnviroWeather, and then you can see what growing degree days we're at currently. So awesome tool that I wanted to share with you. Okay, so step 2 in an IPM program, identifying and diagnosing agents injuring turfgrass. Closely related to monitoring, but the reason why it's not the same is because we are identifying. So you can monitor all you want. You might see changes, but you aren't really identifying what is causing the problem. And also, I found this to be of the utmost importance. Organisms should not be treated as pests until it is proven to be one. There's a lot of species of insects, fungi, nematodes, bacteria that are completely harmless, or they're beneficial to turf. And killing these beneficials through misdiagnosing can cause more harm to the lawn than if we just left it alone. And that can occur through unnecessary pesticide applications. So we want to be mindful of how we're applying, what we're applying, and when we're applying. Many turf disorders are associated with a certain species or cultivar of grass. We're going to dive into that later. I think that's chapter 5 or 6, if I'm not mistaken. And then obviously, knowing the turf grass cultivar is going to help you determine what disorder you're going through. So let's dive into this a little bit, right? How do we diagnose turf disorders? It's really complicated when you're not monitoring it closely because you could have more than one disorder occurring in the turf. And so the best program that you can have is to be on that property as much as you possibly can. You also want to become very familiar with turf damaging agents, right? Insects, diseases, what's going on. Where do you find this information? Reference manuals, attending continuing education seminars, online courses. YouTube has some. There's a lot of different places that you can find information. Purdue has a fantastic book, but it's more or less for weeds. I don't know if they have one for insects or funguses in turf, but I'm sure they do. They have an awesome turf department there. So diagnostic techniques, ask questions. What's going on here? What are the maintenance practices? Do you mow every week? Do you mow every other week? Do you ever mow? Do you irrigate? Do you not irrigate? Have you ever had an aeration? Has there been any damage to the turf? What's going on? Have you ever dumped chemicals on the turf? Like, you need to ask questions of the people that you serve. And you also want to have the necessary tools to conduct a thorough assessment, right? You need a trowel, a soil probe, a sharp knife, possibly a cut coffee can if you're going to do the coffee can technique. You might want a white piece of paper so you can do the paper method and see what comes out on it. Have resources available. Posters, flashcards, books, courses, you name it, right? You need to have all this stuff readily available so you can determine what you're dealing with. And remember, multiple disorders can occur simultaneously. So you might be looking at one, thinking it's just one, but it's actually 2 or 3 different things occurring. So you got to keep your eyes peeled. Okay. Step 3, evaluate the economic significance. So at the end of the day, pest management costs money, right? Whoever's doing it, whether it's the homeowner doing it or whether it's us pesticide applicators working for a company doing it, there's a cost involved. There's time, materials, potential environmental contaminations, and we need to be aware of that. And the cost must be justified by creating an equal or greater benefit to the turf. And we're getting into some important key terms here that you really need to know if you're going to take the exam on turf. Or if not, then we're just doing a little bit of review. So economic injury level is the density of pests that will cause damage to turf. Economic threshold is the density of pests at which point the cost of control is equal to damage or losses the pest will cause. So the economic threshold, when you reach that, it's like, what do? I mean, do you treat it? Do you not treat it? Either way, you're going to be screwed. It's going to cost you money either way. The action threshold is when the density of the pest population reaches the point at which action must be taken to prevent pests from reaching economic injury levels. So the action threshold really is the key here, right? We need to be on point with our action thresholds. How do we set the injury levels or the thresholds? Well, most pests are not a problem until they reach a certain population density. It depends. It depends on a lot of factors, such as temperature, weather, irrigation, or the cultural practices that are occurring. Eradication is almost never going to be the goal of an IPM strategy, so just toss that out the window, right? We already know there's going to be pests, there's going to be damage, we got to tolerate some. Factors that affect the injury levels, it could be the client tolerance. Maybe they don't want any damage whatsoever. They want the perfect lawn. Maybe like, whatever. It's going to depend a lot on them. The visibility, right? The client tolerance and the visibility is going to be kind of like hand in hand. If their lawn's super visible, they're going to want it to be tip top. If it's not that visible, they might just shrug their shoulders and be like, whatever. The amount of maintenance. So if they're doing maintenance once a week or every other week, that'll determine, and that'll also show us kind of what they expect and what we might find there, broadleaf weeds, insects, etc. How healthy is a turf? Is it vigorous? How vigorous? What is the degree of risk from pest injury? Is it going to cause damage? Are we going to kill the turf entirely? Is it going to completely brown out? Like, what's going on here? And then what's the expected reduction through natural enemies? These are all things that we have to consider. So how do we, we're going to continue on that, right? Setting the injury thresholds. People in places of business have varying levels of tolerance, right? And I kind of went over this, right? Homeowners might care about a single dandelion, but yet not realize the rest of their lawn is clover. So that one yellow flower is just bugging them, but they might not know, right? Golf courses, great examples of setting tolerances. They have varying tolerances for fairways, the rough, and putting greens. So they are on point with knowing what tolerances they have. Turf managers are more tolerant of damage when natural controls are expected. So you see some damage, you're like, no big deal, right? We're going to have something natural that comes in and it's going to fix it. And then be prepared to adjust your management strategy, right? This is ever evolving. Every year is different. The weather's always different. This is, different stuff. So we definitely need to be able to adjust on the fly. And every property is different for that matter. All right, so step 4 of the 5 steps of IPM, selecting management tactics. And that'll depend on a lot, right? It's going to depend on the biology of the pest, the host, how the turf is used, how often. When you're selecting a management method, you're likely to limit the pest. You're not going to eradicate, but you're probably going to limit it down to an acceptable number. Acceptable threshold, I guess is the right way to word that. And you want to use the least toxic method so that way non-target organisms and the environment is less damaged and polluted, contaminated. We also want to enhance our natural controls. So if we have anything that can enhance natural controls, then we want to do it, right? If you have a client that's mowing their lawn at 1 inch, which is unacceptable in my opinion, but they're going to expect more weeds in their lawn. They just should, because that turf can't compete against the broadleaf weeds if it's that short. A natural way that's through a management method that's a cultural practice would be to raise the lawn deck up to 3.5, 4 inches, get a super dense canopy of turf. You're naturally going to cut down the weeds that germinate in your lawn. And not very hazardous to an applicator at that point. We need to be conscious of that, right? What is the least hazardous to us? If we could make a recommendation, hey, mow your lawn a little bit higher, that is going to be ideal if you ask me. Hey, I don't have to spray anything on this lawn. You just need to mow higher. Great. And then we also need to make decisions that are least hazardous to those who use it and less likely to injure the grass through phototoxicity. So pest management, in a nutshell, there's two different types. Immediate, short-term suppression. So what do we need to do right now to get this down to an acceptable level? And then also the long-term maintenance. What is a long-term strategy for pest management that we can implement? Those are going to be different, right? Because if the short term is to do a broadcast application of insecticides or herbicides, well, the long term, you're going to eliminate that and you're going to reduce it down to an acceptable level, and you don't need to do broadcast applications anymore, right? That's what you should be thinking. A good pesticide applicator will use both short term and long term. An example for this would be Rhizoctonia. Short term suppression would be to apply fungicide to the susceptible turf. The long-term maintenance could be collect grass clippings and contain the inoculum, right? So there's various ways that we can do this and handle this. So non-chemical pest management methods. Plant resistance is a big one. So selecting quality seed that's resistant to certain disorders. Some species contained endophytic fungi. That endophytic fungi helps grass to repel or kill some insects, which is pretty cool. But this does not mean that it's resistant to grubs, because the endophytic fungi is not in the root systems of these plants. It's in the leaf tissue above ground. But in general, we want to have the correct seed, right? Cultural controls would be mowing, irrigation, fertilization, compaction. All of those are critically important. We're going to dive into them a little bit deeper. But I throw this picture up here because, this looks like a brand new construction of a skate park, a little bowl there for people to skate around in. We can see that there's some newly planted turf that's establishing. They put a fence around it, which is pretty unique. I thought that was pretty cool that they did that. They're trying to get that grass to grow. So they're telling the skaters, hey, don't step over the fence, go around so we can have some nice grass here. So that's just another cultural method that, to establish turf or fix turf issues. Okay. Mechanical and physical controls. Hand removal, not really ideal, but it can be done. Slime mold is one where you could rake out and take away, haul away. Removing weeds, but again, that's not the most practical at all. I don't know anyone that would want to spend their days as a pesticide applicator removing weeds by hand in the lawn. Not going to happen. Traps, you could put traps out there, right? If you do that, you need to double check with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources and Environment. The DNR, or MDNRE is what they're called. They regulate trapping of vertebrae, and the only exceptions are mice, voles, rates. I wrote rates. It's rats, moles, and chipmunks. And if you intend to trap vertebrae not on the exemption list, you will need a wildlife damage investigation and control permit. Now, I don't deal with that. I don't deal with vertebrae or trapping or anything like that. So that's about all I know of that. But definitely, if you wanted to go find out more, check out the Michigan Department of Natural Resources website, or search trapping, or search damage investigation control permit, DNR in Michigan. I'm sure a bunch of stuff is going to pop up. Okay. Biological controls. Limit the pest through natural means, right? That's what we really want to do if we can, right? Fight nature with nature. That's the ideal way to fight this stuff. We could use parasites, parasitoids, predators, and sometimes in certain situations, disease we could use to our advantages. Natural enemies are very abundant in turf, right? There's a whole ecosystem that's going on there, a whole biome, and it's a war every day. And it's a war that most people don't even think about, but it's occurring every day. Predatory and parasitic insects are more sensitive to insecticides than pests that feed on turf. So anytime you make an insecticide treatment on the turf, you're just decimating a ton of beneficial insects. And you need to be aware of that, concerned with it, and how can you not do that? How can you avoid doing that? And this, oh man, this is such a cool slide. So do not mistake beneficial insects for pests, because they're not. They're beneficial. We want to protect those beneficial organisms through avoiding unnecessary pesticide applications. This is such an epic line. Only 10% of lawns develop an insect infestation bad enough to require insecticide applications. 10% of lawns. So I can't tell you how many lawn care companies around here in Michigan, that's just a part of their program that they apply an insecticide for grubs or whatever every year. But right here it says only 10% of lawns need that. And it just blows my mind. But beneficial organisms depend on the availability of pests, right? If they feed on those pests, they depend on them. And when they're not there, those beneficial insects die through starvation. So the turf cannot be completely pest-free and also benefit from biological controls. It just can't happen. So we need to be really conscious when we're doing insecticide treatments on lawns. The U.S. Department of Agriculture evaluates studies on natural enemies, and they have found in their studies that natural enemy control programs can be successful. So you might not need to implement an insecticide application on a lawn. Okay, so additionally, here we go. Some biological controls. Microbial insecticides, Bacillus thuringiensis, BT. I use BT in my mosquito control program like crazy. It's phenomenal. There's various different strains of it, and it's awesome. It's a natural bacteria that kills insect larvae, such as armyworms, cutworms, sod wedworms, or other caterpillars. Bacillus papilliae, or otherwise known as milky spore disease, attacks Japanese beetle grubs, so another bacillus strain. Parasitic nematodes, they'll go after sod webworms, cutworms, grubs, which is pretty cool. So if you can get parasitic nematodes into the ground, they can start going after grubs. Now you don't need to make an insecticide application down there to kill grubs. So when they're applied correctly, this can be very effective without damaging the environment or off-target organisms or beneficial insects. Biological controls are the whip. Chemical controls. Look at that dude in the tractor carrying around that John Beam, just fumigating all these trees. Oh, man, that's wild. I can only imagine the drift of that. But, excuse me, when all other methods have failed, that is when you implement chemical controls, okay? And when you do make chemical controls, you need to make the proper selection of the chemical, and you need the right timing. That's the only way that chemicals can be useful in an IPM program. You want to check the label of those chemicals. Make sure that they're labeled for turf. Don't, if they're labeled for, ornamentals, but not for turf, then don't use them, right? You're using stuff that's labeled for turf. Or it's labeled for forestry sites, but not labeled for turf. Don't use it. Residential lawns, golf courses, generally what you're going to see on labels if it's labeled for turf. And you also want to check the restrictions, right? Some restrictions are from species to species, and that's because the product could possibly cause damage. So pesticides are classified into 4 ways. They're classified 4 ways, not into 4 ways, but classified 4 ways. Types of pest controlled is one way that they're classified. Their chemistry is another way that they're classified. The mode of action, which is another way they're classified. The mode of action is how they work. What do they actually do? And then the formulation. And then when you're selecting a pesticide, you want to check the label for the labeled site. Make sure that you're using on the proper site. You're able to produce the desired result, the least disruptive to the environment, the least toxic to beneficials, the least toxic to people and pets, not phytotoxic. So you're not going to just kill these plants because of sunlight or over application of a chemical. You want to make sure it's economical, that it's compatible with what you're doing or other products that you're using. And it's also acceptable to the public, because sometimes certain things are not acceptable to the public. And then you also want to know your pesticide toxicities. So use pesticides with the highest LD50, which is counterintuitive to what you think. You think, oh, a lower number is less toxic. Well, not in terms of the LD50. Higher numbers means that it takes more of that product to kill 50% of the population. So the higher the number, the less toxic that it actually is, okay? The LD50 is a lethal dose of 50% of the population. Generally speaking, category 3 or category 4 pesticides contain the caution signal word, or they have no signal word. and they would be considered slightly toxic. Slightly toxic or products that contain that caution signal word, they have fewer regulations and less liability associated with accidents involving pesticides, which I don't know if you know this, but what we do, there's a lot of liability involved. We're using chemicals on people's property, there's liability. And so you want to mitigate that as much as possible. Okay. So this pesticide mode of action, this is actually a table that I got out of the Purdue Turfgrass book. I think it's the weed identification for the Turfgrass book. They have a whole table on it. Excuse me. And it tells you, what products and how they work and what is their mode of action. It's really, really cool. But it's basically the manner of how a pesticide works. What is its influence? How does it have the influence or the ability to control a pest? And then what's the potential danger to non-target organisms, right? If you think of a broad spectrum pesticide, they're going to kill a wide range of pests and beneficial organisms. So just know that if you're using a broad spectrum insecticide, you're killing a lot of beneficials. What about a residual pesticide? Well, residual pesticides are going to last. They're going to have a very long-lasting effect, which is nice in one way because it can reduce the amount of applications that you make, but it can damage beneficials long after you've been there and made the application, and also long after you've gotten the pest down to an acceptable level. So we always want to be conscious of what we're doing, what we're using, how we're doing it, etc. All right, so continuing on with the mode of action, right? We have systemic pesticides, which are absorbed and travel within the plant or pest. These are superior as far as an herbicide goes. When you compare a contact herbicide to a systemic herbicide, contact herbicides are only going to kill the portions that they touch, where a systemic will move to the above ground parts and below ground parts, so the root system, and kill everything. Now, systemic insecticides, they can provide long residual control, which makes it easier to control pests that are difficult to control with a contact pesticide. However, I think here it said, in the book, it said less risk to beneficials. And I question that. Systemic insecticides, some of them can be very, very toxic to beneficials long after you make the application, especially if they're flowering. So something like imidacloprid or dinotefron, I don't know that they're necessarily labeled for turf, since I know I use them in ornamentals, but I'm pretty sure there's some imidacloprid products that are labeled for turf, and they have B label warnings on them. So if you get a clover lawn and you're doing an herbicide application to kill the clover and an imidacloprid application, that clover will kill bees left and right until those flowers are dead. So look out for that bee warning label on your products. And that's why I put asterisks right next to that, because it's an unbelievable amount of, misinformation. I don't want to, maybe not misinformation, but maybe not all the information that you need. Okay. Pesticide formulations. There's a lot of different kind of formulations out there. Each one has its advantages and disadvantages. Some might require more or less agitation. Some might be easier to mix and measure. Some might be more difficult. Some might be easier to store. Say you work or live in a cold area like here in Michigan, storage can be an issue. Liquid pesticides can be an issue, but dry pesticides, maybe not as much. Some formulations are just going to cost more, right? Think of ready-to-use products. Think of a gallon of, Roundup at the store in a ready-to-use bottle versus buying a concentrate. Drift is a concern with certain products. You're applying an herbicide and it's going to drift over and damage a bunch of stuff you need to be concerned with. The volatility of a product, right? Is it going to evaporate and rise up and damage other things? Is it phytotoxic? What's the equipment that you need, right? What's the availability of the product? There's all these things that you need to take into account when selecting pesticides and certain types of formulations. So step 5 is to record and evaluate. Detailed records, basically they're going to tell you what you've been doing. Is it working? Are you using the right methods? Are you reducing the pest? Do you need to, alter your method? Do you need to change up the products that you're using? Do you need to change up the timing of your applications, right? It's going to tell you a lot, and it's vital to keep sound records. I can't tell you how vital it is to keep sound records. And honestly, for you guys out there, I highly recommend photo documentation. If you can do photo documentation, that's going to go miles and miles above, anything else out there. And then really the evaluation is going to tell you, did it work? What can we adjust? And is it cost effective? I constantly evaluate that in my own company with what I do. Is it working? Is it cost effective? What can we do? Can we change up the products, or can we reduce what we're doing? You play those games and you try and figure it out to make the best program that you possibly can. Oh, it looks like we're done here. All right. So that wraps up chapter 1. A lot of information, man. The core chapters, I got down to, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes a chapter. This one took me 50. We're on 51 minutes right now, which is insane. So a lot of information. There's only 8 chapters in this book, and they're really densely packed. Some chapters are kind of light. Some chapters are heavy. So we're going to have to dive into it. But this is all about turf grass. And I appreciate you, watching here. This is kind of for 2 purposes, right? I'm going to put this on YouTube for you guys, but I'm also going to put this in my classes. So I have a company called Elevate Applicate. It's an education program here for pesticide applicators. And it's going to help get people their pesticide application credits, which is pretty cool. So leave me a comment. Let me know. How did I do? Was this too long? 51 minutes is a long time to watch a video, man, but there's so much information to go over. So without further ado, here's chapter 1. Let's dive into chapter 2. I'll see you there.